just took place here. And now, the now part of jazz bass now is that we have some amazing, a new generation of bassists who are coming up with some incredible sounds. Thundercat, Derek Hodge, who have just played, with R plus R equals now. Can you talk about, to your ears, what do you hear happening now with what they're doing, the use of MIDI, et cetera, like what Thundercat is doing?
I mean, I think it's interesting because when I was hanging out with Bernard Wright, who grew up with Marcus in Jamaica, Queens, an incredible keyboard player, I recommend you all check out his first record called Nard, N-A-R-D, which Marcus is playing all over, that Bernard recorded when he was like 15. Like Marcus said, it was just, if you were going to play in Jamaica, Queens, you had to be able to play funk and you had to be able to play jazz. And I think after like kind of maybe the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, that stopped being the case. There became a real division where jazz, I think, started to live in universities and was largely played by people like me who had no real connection to the kind of cultural relevance of the music. And so as a result of that, the music became highly intellectual. And I don't mean that as a compliment. Do you know what I mean? It became kind of like, who can write the most complicated song with the hardest time signature and make it as difficult as possible for an audience to enjoy themselves? That was like, that's how you measured a great jazz musician, I think in like 2001, It was like, how many people can they turn off while they play, It was really like that in my college. It was just, there was no emphasis on fundamental groove or fundamental melody, or the teachers were trying to drill it into our heads, but the students were interested in being complex. And I think what's happened recently, thanks to the great musicians of Marcus's time, and also the new great musicians of our time, like Esperanza and like Robert Glasper and Roy Hargrove's RH Factor and all these bands, they've done basically what Marcus's generation did 30 years ago, which is they brought that other side back to jazz. The groove-based side, the heart, the spiritual side, the side that lives more in churches than in colleges, And I think as a result of that, jazz festivals are selling tickets. Jazz records are, I wouldn't say records are selling again, but people are streaming it at least, people are listening to it, And I think that we lost our way for a long time as jazz musicians, but to me it feels like, I wasn't there when it happened that first time, but I feel like it's a similar thing, and it always has a similar result. When you combine jazz tradition and vocabulary with like a really spiritual element and groove, then it's kind of just like everyone likes it, right? I don't know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It brings people together. I actually remember doing gigs where the musicians would say to each other backstage, let's see how many people we can get up and get out of their seats and leave. You know what I mean? Because it's kind of like the nerds took over jazz for a while.
Yeah, totally.
They were learning jazz in college as opposed to in the streets. Because if you learn jazz in the community, you're always playing in front of people. And you realize that there's two sides, And when I learned jazz, it was watching my uncle groove to Miles or Sonny Stitt or whoever it was. So I saw what
that uncle being Wynton Kelly, right?
It was Wynton's brother.
Oh,
Wynton was playing.
Okay.
But Uncle Big Willie was going, yeah, baby. And so I saw physically what jazz is supposed to do to people. It wasn't just here. There was a connection. And all the complicated bebop musicians, they all played in swing bands during the day, or in the evening, and then at night, late night, they played bebop for themselves. But there was always a tradition of having that balance between the rhythm and the soulfulness and the complexity of jazz. Duke Ellington. You didn't need to go to college to appreciate Duke Ellington. If you went, you might appreciate some of the finer harmonic things he was doing, but it didn't matter. It wasn't necessary, Now you see the kids, man, and everything's in a weird time signature, which is cool, but the soul was missing. And now, most recently, like you said, all of a sudden it seems like the guys are getting back to that. You know what? It has to have both. You're not allowed to choose. I'm a groove player, no, I'm a harmonic player. No, you're not allowed to choose. You have to have both.
I think also they're incorporating a lot of elements from popular music that has nothing to do with like people like Derek Hodge with Thundercat or Tim LaFave, who is one of my favorite bass players, who's maybe a little lesser known than the other guys, but really Tim LaFave, if you don't know this bass player, he's unbelievable. Right now he plays in the Tedeschi Trucks band, but he's one of the most brilliant bass players I've ever heard, simulating like electronic music sounds, like deep house stuff and like drum and bass music. His soundscape is so beautiful and sense of groove. So a lot of jazz musicians are also pulling in from the hip-hop world and the electronic world. They're kind of like using history as an advantage, you know, pulling from Marcus's thing, also pulling from the jazz thing, and pulling from like a totally other world. It's so deep because low end is in every style of music, basically, right?
Absolutely. And it keeps jazz alive, because if musicians hadn't been pulling things in from other styles, jazz would have been done by like 1950, you know. But Dizzy Gillespie went and visited, and he brought Afro-Cuban musicians to New York, and they started making that combination. And then the Puerto Ricans in New York started messing around with this boogaloo beat, and all of a sudden Lee Morgan said, I want to get some of that. And next thing you know, you had Sidewinder and those kind of feeling. And then in the 70s, you know, Tony Williams and Miles Davis and these guys started incorporating funk and rock, and then Herbie Hancock, of course, with the Headhunters. If you hadn't been adding those new elements to jazz all along, it would just be museum music right now. So I think it's really important to take whatever you like, if you're a jazz musician, and see what you can do with it, see what kind of mix you can create.
That's a great answer. In fact, it kind of brings it all back full circle from that first question I asked about jazz being the bridge. I've always thought that jazz is the most curious and the hungriest and most open of musics, in the way that it is always trying to incorporate other styles inside it, and that's what keeps it alive. You know?
You should see Herbie Hancock when he hears something new. He goes, and you know who used to do the same? Wayne Shorter would be like, and Miles Davis would be like, what is that? Like curiosity, you know what I mean? Like, what is that, and how can I use it? How can I take the thing that I like about it, the thing that appeals to me about it, and how can I use it in my music? Miles used to say that to me. What's that? What's that sound? We're listening to the radio, and I say, those are just hand claps. He said, where's the snare drum? I said, they're not using the snare drum. The hand claps on the machine have replaced the snare drum. Write me something like that. That's where he was at, man. He was just like, what's new? What's exciting?
That's right. You know, we have a few minutes left, and I was wondering if we could get back to the bass, and if you would like to start something off, Michael, and, you know, bring more.
Kick it off.
What? Oh man.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that.
I'll play something maybe Marcus might recognize. Turn it up, man. Perfect.
Producing sweat. That's what I was producing. I was producing anxiety.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Miller, Michael Lee, Jazz Bass Now.